Well, thanks for joining us for part two of Democracy, Climate, and Water in the West. And I'm so pleased to be joined by our panel of three experts, Tilly Walton, Ravi Mehta, and David Marquis. And these folks have been really looking hard at all the aspects of water, particularly as water is the solution and how it flows through all our lives. So I'd just like to start the second part of our conversation today with David Marquis, an extraordinary writer, producer, who wrote a book called The River Always Wins. And it's just such a fantastic metaphor and title of a book that is something that affects every human being on the planet. David, would you mind just kicking us off perhaps with an inspirational thought or two around rivers and your recent work?
Sure. Thank you, Chip. We'll go to chapter 9, the rains. This chapter follows chapter 8, which is about drought. So this is about the rains, when the rains return. You have to love the rain, the way the grass loves it, the way a dry creek bed loves it. We have to prepare ourselves, soften ourselves, so the returning goodness can soak in, be absorbed, and not run off. Our culture has become a hard-pan, hard-baked place in desperate need of rain, a slow, soul-soaking rain of human kindness. And when that water does come down from the sky, it runs toward the sea. The river always, eventually, runs toward it, never away. So too does human progress, moving always toward the greater water. The drops have purpose, each one. Be ready for your purpose, prepared to move to the sea.
Beautiful. And maybe Ravi, you mentioned water coming out of the dam as being very cold along the Colorado River in our last episode, and I wonder, if that dam, the metaphor of the dam, the blockage, the stoppage that Tilly has put so much of her work into, opening up these dams and letting the water flow and the life come back up river like the salmon that migrate. Can we talk a little bit about the importance of that flow state?
Sure, yeah. I mean, dams have two purposes, right? One is to manage the river or manage the flow. So we could harmonize with it in balance of our human needs, so to speak. And the other is to store water so we have enough water for future in the cases of droughts and other anomalies that might take place. However, it also has an impact on the environment. Salmon can't go upstream as a result of it. A lot of the water never gets to the ocean, which is where a lot of the deltas are where a lot of the life flourishes. So really there needs to be a balance between what and when we dam certain things, to create that management mechanism so it doesn't flood and drought, with huge variances. But also the environment being able to participate in that conversation, so to speak. So one of our goals with Water Ledger is really to give the environment a seat at the table and an economic voice. And the solution categories that we're focused on, there's three categories. I could stretch it to four, but the real categories are quantity, making sure there's enough water, between all the players. And the three major players are agriculture, cities, and industry. The environment is not a player. So what we're doing is trying to create a platform and a mechanism that gives the environment a voice, an economic voice, and makes them a player to buy back its own water, so to speak, through market mechanisms for the West. The second is quality, right? Make sure the water quality and the nitrates and the phosphates are managed properly, which in a lot of cases they're not. And the third is access. Access is infrastructure and price, right? So whether it's a poor village in Africa digging a well or a disadvantaged community, in California, which still there's a lot of disadvantaged communities in California that don't have access to water. So addressing those three issues, I'd add a fourth, which is timing, making sure the water, is hitting the right places at the right time. But those three are the main categories that we're focused on. And to be able to manage that properly, we need a much more sophisticated and complex mechanism in place. And that's what we're aspiring to do, is create this platform, the water recharge platform, to first address the quantity, to make sure there's enough water in the rivers, and the water that's being wasted or over irrigated goes back into the rivers, and everyone's incented to do that.
So this is a very functional mechanism that you're creating with Water Ledger to give companies, industries, individuals an opportunity to put their money to work on the solution side of fixing the problems that we experience with water.
Yeah, that's the intention, is to create a marketplace, right? So there are the companies, at least there's a trend for corporations to be more conscious. Conscious capitalism is a kind of a new movement that's taken place over the last 10 years. And part of that consciousness is not offsetting just their carbon, but also offsetting their water footprint. And so they have a need to be able to do that. They can't do that easily because they're not in the water business. At least most of them are not. And then there's this other side. There's the side that's driven by NGOs and other nonprofits that are focused on trying to do these projects, but they have very little funding to do it, or access to funding. And then there's the people that own or run the water rights, and they have water that they can monetize, or if they can make more money off of it by putting it into the environment, they would gladly do so and make sure there's no risk of them losing their water right. So those, and then you have the government or the agencies in the middle that's supposed to administrate and manage all this stuff and paper it, right? So we're kind of in the middle of all of those players and coordinating all of those aspects together to optimize the benefits for everybody. So that's our main function, is to optimize and balance those functions and needs for all those players.
That's fantastic. A few years ago, we were all focused on Standing Rock, where water is life was the rally cry, and that was in response to a lot of this tar sand development up in the north of Canada, which has terribly impacted the wetlands and the rivers and the water up that way, and particularly the indigenous people. And I thought, Tilly, maybe I saw you in a PBS special recently where you were talking about some of the hieroglyphs that you experienced on some of the canyon walls by some of the ancient peoples that used to live along the Colorado drainage. And I wonder if you could bring in the indigenous perspective around that.
I will do my best. One thing that I'm always very aware of, especially when I go down the Colorado River, is that the river, I'm going through the homeland of so many sovereign nations, like of the Navajo, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Wallapai. Many of the tribes are so deeply connected to the source of the Colorado River. Like, for example, the Havasupai means people of the blue-green waters. And a lot of these folks a lot of the Native American tribes have their roots. For example, the Hopi tribe, if you go onto the Little Colorado River, which flows into the main stem of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, there's a very, very sacred spot called a Sipapu, which is where the Hopi believe that they emerged from the world that they were in prior to this one into this world. And it was really interesting to be there, especially during this time of COVID, because in some senses of the way, we're going through this huge transformation right now as a society, where we're finding these things that don't work, and we're almost having a rebirth into a more sustainable way of being. But in the meantime, we do have the issues of social justice. So, for example, the Navajo and the Hopi live on the rim of the Grand Canyon, and many of the communities don't have access to internet. Many of the communities don't even have access to running water. And so during a world pandemic, where we're all told to wash our hands as a preventative mechanism, many of the tribal members don't even have access to running water to wash their hands. And so I think we have a great deal to learn. There's so much indigenous wisdom when it comes to water, not only respecting the water, but how we interact with it, how we manage it. And also from the indigenous sovereign nations were, I think they may turn out to be the leaders in some of the new things, such as rights for the river, treating the river, you know, if a corporation can have rights, well, why can't we have a river that has rights as well? And so I think we will actually, in the long run, be looking to a lot of our indigenous communities for leadership in the realm of water.
Thank you so much for those insights. And I was really happy that you just mentioned the rights of water, which leads to the rights of nature. And so I'd like to open the conversation up to that exact place where we're talking about the rights of life, the rights of the planet Earth, the living, breathing being, just like you and I, that's 70% water. And Mother Earth, you know, she has a fever now, just like we do with the pandemic. And she's, you know, and she's shaking. And we have got to hold the line and support the indigenous people, in my view, on biodiversity, because all of the indigenous people of the planet are living on that. They're protecting the remaining biodiversity. So can we talk about the rights of nature and really what that means through the lens of water? Go ahead.
Well, and it's a growing movement to give legal rights to water. And as it relates to rivers in particular, it gives rights to a river. So the right to have water, the right to flow, the right to not be polluted. And so it's really giving a voice to water, a voice to the rivers, and a voice to the source that we all depend on for life. Yet it doesn't have any protection per se without creating these mechanisms and really stepping forward. And so I'll just bring up Bristol Bay as an example. There is a mine that's scheduled to go in that would be the world's largest copper mine and gold mine. And in Bristol Bay, there's a huge salmon fishery. And so, for example, when I went walking in the John Muir Woods the other day, came along a creek that they were restoring. I said, "What are you doing?" They said, "We're restoring it for the salmon." I said, "Great, is it working?" And they said, "Well, last year one salmon returned." And conversely, in Bristol Bay, each year over 50 to 60 million salmon return each year. So the rights of nature and giving the river rights will protect, it has a legal mechanism to protect it so that the rivers in Bristol Bay aren't polluted by the mining and aren't polluted by mine tailings or mine waste that would destroy this huge ecosystem that we thrive on, that the whole planet thrives on.
Wow, great analogy. Robbie, can you talk about how the water ledger could come at it from the other side to help protect the rights of nature and even endorse that?
Yeah, so I mean, when I talked about the problem areas of, you know, quantity, quality, and access, you know, there are several tools we have to help solve and address those problem areas, right? So we have technology, that helps give us more data and more understanding of what the real issues are and how much, what amounts and what it is that we need to resolve and solve for and do it in a more accurate way. Then we have capital markets, which incentivizes behavior, you know, to move and change behavior or incentivize and reward behavior to do certain things. And capital markets, I include nonprofit work within capital markets because it's still money that's being used to do and accomplish certain projects and incentivize behavior. The third is regulation and policy, right? So that's where the state and or the country and the regulators could come in and establish this river has its own rights. And you know, there are several countries that have done this. There's 2 rivers in the world that actually have its own rights. One is in New Zealand, and the other one's in South America. I can't remember exactly where. However, you know, Nepal, for example, is a country that in their constitution they've established constitutionally different rights for different aspects of their country. So, for example, in Nepal, 60% of the country has to maintain its forest coverage. You know, I think they're around 70% right now. So if it goes below 60%, then the state meaning the nation has to do something to recover the balance. So that's regulations at the national level, and it could go all the way down to your local county or region or community. And then the fourth is culture, right? So this is where us individually have and value these resources beyond needing these mechanisms to tell us what the value is, right? And the Native Americans have been the most vocal from a cultural standpoint. At Standing Rock, I was there as well, and hearing them referred to as the water protectors, and they had no money, they had no technology, they had no regulations or policy on their side, but they were standing in front of these armies ready to drill a pipeline underneath the river, and it was their culture that drove that behavior, which is the most powerful if you could align that correctly. But sometimes you need these other mechanisms because the alignments are not all there, at least from a cultural standpoint, but it builds over time. But that is always the end goal, is to get the culture in alignment to move and create and maintain harmony and balance with the environment. So what we do as water ledgers, once again, as a mechanism and a platform, we're trying to use these tools to ultimately align or realign culture. And we use the markets, we use regulations and public policy, and we use technology through our platform and our data science to be able to take these various aspects and bring them together, ultimately to evolve the culture.
So what I hear you talking about really is a step towards an ecological civilization, a collaborative capitalism. Systems that we're now beginning to transition and perhaps transform just the way that we're living on the planet, so that we can functionally survive and help all of our brothers and sisters in terms of the animals and the plants, and as the Lakota say, Matakwe Ase, all our relations, that all life is connected, just like the water is connected all over the planet. David, are you all looking at the rights of nature in your work down there in the Texas area?
It's a growing consciousness, and thank goodness for it. Because I think that one of the things where we meaning Western civilization, took a wrong turn when we began to see ourselves as separate from nature. Because as soon as you separate yourself from nature, you are lost, and you have to find your way home. And I think that we, as a global civilization, as an American civilization, I think here in Texas, we are slowly finding our way home to understand that we are not separate from. We are all tied together. Not just all human beings, but all beings, all the entire cosmos is tied together. And I'm going to very quickly read you a very beginning from chapter 4, which is about the headwaters. It is the headwaters of movement, for all activity on the earth is tied to the movement of water, of tides, of rivers and rainfall, of drinking water moving through pipes, of crops and hydropower, of wild animals on the Serengeti migrating to watering holes. And that movement, the movement of water, is tied to gravity and slope and the moon to the earth, and the earth to the sun, and to the far reaches of the universe. If we come to understand that our worlds don't end at the end of our own fingertips, but that we all are connected, and we're not separate from nature, that's the beginning. That's the beginning of new ways of thinking about solving problems, the kind of solutions that Tilly and Rave are talking about, the way we're looking at building urban wetlands here in Dallas. The John Booker Sands wetlands just outside of Dallas. It's a 2,000-acre wetlands created by human beings who saw a better way to filter water and put it back into the water system here in North Texas. And there's so many ways that we have to have that understanding for us to solve problems. For example, North Texas used to be an area of several 100,000 people, and it rained a lot back in those days. Now we have 7.5 million people in North Texas. And our reservoirs are at full capacity. As soon as we get a drought, they drop off precipitously. And when we were a young city and growing fast, we just planted anything because we could water it. Well, now we have landscapes all over North Texas, a 16-county area, that do not belong. the type of grass we use, the type of trees we use, the type of flowers we use in commercial and home landscaping take up enormous amounts of water because we planted things that didn't belong here, because back in the day, there weren't that many people and there's plenty of water. Well, guess what? Now when a drought hits, there's not much water and there are an awful lot of people. So we separated ourselves from nature, and now we find ourselves trying to get back to nature to create native landscapes, xeriscapes, in order for us to be able to sustain North Texas. So it's a classic example of not just something distant, but the yard outside your house right now, the type of tree that you have in your yard right now that uses up more water than it needs to, or that it really ought to be using. It's in the wrong place. That tree's not happy here. That tree doesn't belong here. That tree belongs 100 miles east in East Texas in the forest. So these are issues we have to really take a hard look at, is how do we change that? And one of the first things we have to do is a cultural change, which is to see ourselves as part of nature, not separate from nature.
Beautiful. You know, in terms of the hydrological cycles impacting the West, you know, David, I know you're talking to us from North Texas, and I'm in Aspen, Colorado. I know Tilly lives in Aspen, part-time. Rave and Tilly both live in San Francisco also. And so that really kind of encompasses this conversation of climate and water in the West. And so this is area that's been terribly impacted by drought. I think that we're going into our probably maybe 15th year. It's been a really long run. And so let's just take, for instance, the city of Phoenix, Arizona. I think there's probably around 8 million people that live down there. And now they're starting to experience days that are in excess of 110 degrees, too many of them. And water is becoming a critical issue. So as we go forward, how can we think about activating our fellow citizens of the West to become conscious of the situation, of what water actually is, what it means, what it does, but then to take action upon that?
Chip, I'd like to jump in here if I might, just real quickly. I'd love to hear from Tilly and Ravi also, but I wonder if we can't find a way to involve people in directly solving these problems. And I think it's going to take a lot of solutions. I think what Ravi's working on is brilliant. I think that's great. What Tilly's doing is wonderful. I think we also have the ability now to reach large numbers of people quickly and to get them involved in returning, for example, the Colorado River to the sea. Now it tragically plays out way too soon. And I wonder if we could find people in all those different states and get people to agree that if we could, each as a municipality, as a person, use 3% less water. Let's just find a low number people can agree on. And then demonstrate the water moving forward, getting closer to the sea. The more that we conserve for their large agricultural users or civic users or people in their own homes. But could we agree that there's a goal we have? And that goal is to get that river to the greater water, to let it live out its natural life, and demonstrate to people literally day by day in real time where that river is. Can we move it forward? And look at all the different solutions it's going to take for us to do that. You know, air quality in Los Angeles, we all know how bad it used to be. Still not great on some days, but it's better than it used to be. And it took an enormous amount of work. Clean Air Act, local, state, federal initiatives and ordinances and legislation. And yet today, there has been some progress in creating cleaner air. So can we do that with the river? Can we replenish a river together? And can we get people to understand their connection to nature by taking that on together? And I'm just going to put that out there as an example of something we might be able to do that will take multiple solutions, a lot of people involved, but could we get people involved in such a way that we could demonstrate the progress on a daily basis to see how that river is doing and be directly involved in the health of a river?
Yeah, you know, I'll pick up on that, David, and I think you're 100% right. I think what's missing the most from the problem or the upcoming water scarcity crisis. I mean, the water scarcity crisis that we're in now. I mean, as Chip mentioned, we're actually in a mega drought right now, which is, I think, a 1,400-year drought cycle. So the missing ingredient is people. You know, the general population has no idea that we're in a drought situation for the most part, or some might, but not not most. They turn their tap on and they see water, they think everything is fine. They have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. So there's a disconnect between the people that are managing our water on this side and all the users on this side. And the discrepancy is this is literally 1% of the total population, at least in the US. If you take the utilities and the board members and calculate it all out, literally 1% of our population manages the water for the other 99%. And the 99% has no idea what the 1% is doing and why and how. And connecting that cycle so there's a feedback loop helps build a culture. And using these mechanisms like markets and public policy and regulations and technology to make that more visible and accessible and easier to play in, so to speak. And I use the word play very intentionally because, you know, my most fun moments as a child with water was playing with water, right? Running through hydrants and swimming and all that stuff. So allowing the public to engage and play with water in a way that's fun and also productive, I think, is the missing ingredient. And that's, once again, that's part of what we're trying to accomplish, you know, with our platforms and mechanism, and really essentially building a movement, you know, around water conservation, and not just water conservation, but water harmony, right? If you have a lot of water, you don't need to conserve it, like in times of floods, but responsible management of water ultimately is what we need to really focus on. And, you know, what you talked about, you know, getting rivers back to the deltas and to the ocean is a really important aspect of circulating and how our carbon cycles work, because the rivers are the circulatory network that brings inland carbon back to the oceans for storage. And if it stops before that, then the carbon goes back to the atmosphere. So, you know, I know Tilly was involved in a really exciting and interesting project called the Pulse, where they actually did bring water for a moment, Colorado River, back to the ocean. And maybe you could talk to that a little bit, Tilly.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about all of our connections to water, because it's you know, for example, the Colorado River, we have the economics. It provides over $1.4 trillion in economic activity. And, you know, like Chip said, it's 40 million people are relying on this for their drinking water. And yet we've somehow lost our connection to the water and the importance of it. And we've also lost this connection of the river flowing to the sea. And so, as Rave mentioned, in 2014, Mexico and the United States and a whole lot of nonprofits worked together to kind of bank the water and simulate a flood for the water to make it from, because right now the Colorado River, very few people know this, but it runs dry on American soil. The Colorado River ends in a little tiny trickle that you can step over, and it's filled with plastic bottles, and it's into a vast dry riverbed of sand. So it doesn't even reach the ocean. And so this flood allowed the water to reconnect briefly with the ocean. And as I mentioned earlier, what was so unique about this is, one, it fed all the plants and the animals that have been hibernating for years, and it really helped the wildlife, but it really revived the community's connection to the river. I think the part that we didn't expect to see was how excited people were to be at the river's edge and laughing and playing, and horses dancing, and kids playing in the water. And just that reconnecting to that vital water source was for me personally, the coolest part of the experiment. And so I think that's really what we can do is connect, you know, realize our economic connection and take these economic steps, but also this importance of movement building and reconnecting ourselves to this source on a visceral level. And so maybe for some that means going down to, if you live on the ocean, down to the ocean's edge and connecting to water there, or going to your local park and sitting by the lake, or maybe there's a little local waterfall if you're lucky enough to live near some wilderness. And so there's these many opportunities, I think, to just connect on a day-to-day level. And also, I think as us who are involved in this water movement, really remembering the importance of connecting people back in, because I think too often our movement, I feel like we've gotten carried away into the focus only on nature. And there is this dance that we do between us as humans and this living, breathing thing that is the river. And so reconnecting both us as humans back to the river and the importance of the river, I think is something that we can do as we're working together. And that, like I said, can be as simple as going down to your local park and just having an awareness and keeping an ear out for, oh, what does that mean if they want to put a dam in on my local river? Or what does that mean if they want this mine to come in? So learning, taking the opportunity to learn a little bit more as well.
That's wonderful. I'd like, as we come to the end of our time here, I'd like to do a quick round robin on solution. And so I'm going to start it off by telling you a quick story about my friend Bob Nixon, who started something called the Earth Conservation Corps on the Anacostia River. And he got really incredibly poor people, mostly people of color. This is in Washington, D.C. And they went in and they took thousands of tires out. And these kids that were hanging out in the streets and were having problems with drugs and alcohol and broken families and such, all of a sudden were immersed into the river that they cleaned up over a very short period of time. And over a few years, what was once a very filthy area of pollution and trash began to rejuvenate. And I wanted to ask you all if you might know of something similar, or you just said a beautiful story about the Pulse Chili, but maybe we could just go around quick and then we can conclude our program.
I'd be glad to jump in. We have taken on a major project to get people to be more involved in the Trinity River. The Trinity River is the largest single watershed in Texas. Half of the people in Texas are impacted by the Trinity. Fort Worth, Dallas, and Houston flows all the way down to Galveston Bay. And yet many people in North Texas have no consciousness of this river at all. So worked with a group, and we recently got National Recreation Trail designation from the Department of the Interior, National Park Service, so that we will now have a trail that will ultimately become the largest urban nature park in the world. Of all the nature preserves and parks along the Trinities that flows through North Texas. So we've taken a specific step to get people more involved with the river, which now is largely ignored in North Texas. So we've taken on a specific goal, which is to get people closer to the Trinity, and then to clean up the water as people get closer to it. People have real-time data about the water quality. So that's one thing that we've done here, and that came through just a couple of weeks ago. So.
Fabulous. Ravi?
Yeah, I think just kind of thinking through the water, media is another tool that we seem to overlook and not use efficiently when it comes to these types of movements. And it's a powerful tool and mechanism. And we have social media used through technology. We have traditional media, which is the television and film mediums and even music. But I think we should really look at leveraging more of that because that's how we get the awareness out, right? So engaging the public and those that want to be water warriors. I consider everyone on this Zoom kind of a water knight, so to speak. We've been in the battle, on the front lines for a long time doing this, but we want to engage more water protectors and water warriors to pick up the fight and continue to help shift our culture to a point where this happens innately and the systems are there to support it, right? So I think leveraging the media is a missing ingredient also that we could do much better at taking advantage of. And whether it's, films, television shows, documentaries, social media, movement building and awareness building, and education, educational expansion is a big piece. And so I would just offer that thinking about ways to do that more effectively would be really a big boon to our efforts here.
Thank you. Tilly, would you like to offer a concluding thought?
Sure. Oh my gosh, for solutions, there's so many exciting things that could be done. I mean, I think even just beginning with diversity of widening the pot, having more diverse voices in youth. I watched some of the earlier AREDAY shows. I mean, these teenagers are doing such amazing work, and this is the planet that we want to leave a better place for our kids and our youth. And also just, there's so many opportunities, like instead of erecting, there's so many new technological solutions. So instead of building an old school dam, like do a run of the river electrical generation, so where you don't have to block the entire flow of the river, yet you can still get electricity. Different methods of more efficient watering of our crops. Israel is one of the leading people in water efficiency. And so there's so many sort of tech solutions that are available. And then, as you mentioned, Chip, with the Earth Conservation Corps, South Africa has a whole entire program called Working for Water and Working for Wetlands. And they employ, like, this could be such an opportunity with COVID and so many people losing jobs, to have a restoration corps where the government could help provide temporary jobs for people and just create it where people are restoring rivers. And that's how they're earning money and gaining new skills. And so there's a whole new restoration economy that we have the potential to go into. And as we start to get into solutions like solar and things like this could be such an opportunity to create jobs, restore rivers, and restore our connection back to water.
Thank you so much for bringing us to that place, Tilly. I'm so delighted that John Kerry will become our climate czar. I know he's on the climate task force, and they're talking about a climate corps. So I think that these ideas are very important to put forward to the incoming administration, because we've got a lot of work to do ahead of us. So I think that I would at this point ask David to bring us home, if you will, with some concluding thoughts from your wonderful book. And folks, we hope that we'll be continuing this water dialogue, and please check back often to see the latest AREDAY virtuals programs that we'll be putting out. But David, please.
Thank you, Chip. This is from chapter 12, The River Always Wins. And what do the drops, the people, learn from this? They learn to move with purpose toward goodness, and that the journey has been worth it. Even the floods and the rapids and the drought. They learn that there is progress and hope in all things human, and that time is not an ultimate measure. The drops learn that the culmination of this long, arduous way is the knowledge that they are just getting started. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Tilly, and thank you, Rave. Thank you all so much for bringing your wisdom and your vision and your love for water to today's program. And thank you, folks, for coming and supporting AREDAY, and we hope to see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you, Chip.
Bye.
Thank you, Chip, for all that you do. Thank you, David and Rave.
Thank you, Tilly. Thank you, David. Thank you, Chip.
Thank you. Tilly and Rave, it's been a pleasure and an honor. Thanks. Chip, thank you.